Hey everyone, tonight we're heading somewhere quiet, somewhere soft-lit and heavy with silk and silence. The royal courts of medieval Europe. A place of jewels, whispers, and women you've never heard of. Not queens, not noble ladies, but the others, the ones without titles, without names. The royal mistresses, tucked behind drapes and forgotten halls. This wasn't a life of romance or power. It was a life of waiting, of living and fading by the glance of a king who might forget your name by morning. So before we start, take a breath, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that familiar hum, grab a cup of something warm. And if you enjoy drifting through the sad, strange corners of history with me, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights. Let the world fade for a while. And let's begin with the story of women who lived in palaces, but died as ghosts. You weren't a queen. You weren't even officially anything. Just there. Somewhere between the seamstress and the furniture. You lived in a palace, yes. But not on its steps of power. More like somewhere tucked behind the curtains, barely part of the scenery. You had no title, no legal standing, no throne to stand beside. When nobles passed, they didn't bow. They didn't even look. You were part of the hush, part of the background noise that never quite spoke too loud. In fact, being noticed might have been the worst thing. It meant someone remembered you existed. Most days were quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. You moved in soft slippers and whispered greetings, always careful not to look too happy, too sad, too anything. Joy was suspicious. Tears were inconvenient. You learned to smile in mirrors and silence your own footsteps. There was no record of your presence. No one tracked your meals or your moods. The steward didn't keep count. You weren't in the family tree or painted in portraits. If you vanished one morning, no one would demand a search. They'd just quietly assign your room to someone else and move on. And you couldn't leave. Not really. The palace was your world, but not by choice. You were both privileged and imprisoned. You had silk sheets, but no freedom. Gold cups, but no name etched into them. You might sit beside a window, watching noblewomen ride out, knowing you'd never go farther than the corridor leading to the king's chambers. Your position, if it could be called that, was entirely dependent on someone else's whims. A single bored glance from the king might summon you into relevance. A single forgotten evening, and you'd become less than a rumor. That was the scale you lived on. A heartbeat could shift your fate from velvet to nothingness. Servants whispered about you, not cruelly, just out of habit. You were her, the one who arrived last season, the one with the sad eyes. Or was it someone else? Names blurred quickly when you weren't supposed to matter. Even the guards who passed your door forgot to greet you after a while. And you couldn't complain. Not out loud. To who? The queen? The priest? There was no system for mistresses. No formal grievance process. You weren't protected by marriage, by law, or by tradition. If someone decided you were troublesome, inconvenient, too ambitious, or too visible, you were gone. Just gone. Sometimes, new girls arrived. Daughters of lesser nobles. Former ladies in waiting, pretty maids who caught the wrong eye at the wrong time. You tried not to look at them too long, because you knew how it started, and you knew how it ended. So, you became quiet, small, practiced your vanishing, wore dull colours, smiled only when no one could see. You were expected to be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Present, but not outspoken. Graceful, but never demanding space. Your job, unofficially, was to not be a problem, and being noticed, for the wrong reasons, was always a problem. At night, you'd lie awake in a room full of tapestries and hush. Sometimes, you'd wonder if you were still the girl you used to be, the one with songs in her head and names for the stars. But the stars were gone now, replaced by carved ceilings and candle smoke, and the only name that mattered wasn't yours, it was his. You wouldn't last a day, not in silence this loud. It didn't matter who you were before, whether you were born to a faded noble line or grew up plucking herbs in a village too small for maps. Once you stepped inside those gilded halls, your worth condensed into something frighteningly fragile, the king's attention. Not love, not even affection, just attention, a glance, a touch, a pause in his schedule that happened to include your name. That alone could raise you up, dress you in silk, feed you fruits out of season, give you a room with a door that actually locked. And when that attention drifted, everything went with it. Your gowns stopped arriving. Your maidservant was reassigned. You were told the king was busy, though no one said it outright. Your invitations vanished. The food at dinner turned cold before reaching you. The flowers wilted, and you knew. Because the court was full of women who once had the king's eye. You could spot them by how carefully they didn't look at you. Some were still beautiful. Most had learned to become invisible. You couldn't ask for more time. You couldn't plead or remind him of sweet moments whispered over wine. That wasn't how it worked. His favor wasn't a promise. It wasn't an agreement. It was weather. And when the weather changed, all you could do was wrap your dignity in silence and try not to freeze. If he smiled at you in public, people watched. If he didn't, they looked away. Your entire orbit revolved around where he chose to cast his light. And when that light moved, so did the world. You were not a woman with power. You were a woman with proximity to it. And that proximity had a ticking clock. So you became careful. Not clever. Clever could be dangerous. Just careful. Not too bold, not too shy, not too eager, not too cold. Your life became a study in moderation, all performed for an audience of one. And sometimes, he wouldn't even look at you, not for days, weeks, until one day you realized the silence had settled, solid, permanent. No farewell, no closure, just absence. The room across the hall wasn't yours anymore. The candle that used to burn outside your chamber stopped being lit at dusk. Your name didn't come up in conversation unless someone needed an example of a woman who used to matter. You wouldn't last a day, not in a world where your entire existence depended on the whim of someone who barely remembered yesterday. You weren't married. That was the first thing. There was no ring, no ceremony, no contract sealed with wine and witnesses. You shared the king's bed, perhaps his thoughts for a while, maybe even his child, but never his name. And that meant, in the eyes of the law, you were no one. If the queen was a crown, you were a shadow. You had no legal claim, not to land, not to titles, not even to the safety of your own room. If someone slapped you in the hallway, there was no trial. If your chamber door was broken down, no one asked questions. You weren't considered property exactly, just not worth protecting. There were no laws written for women like you, no rules about inheritance, legitimacy, or respect. Even scandal had its limits, and you were always one breath away from being its easy target. He could tire of you, say nothing, have you removed in the middle of the night and replaced by someone younger, quieter, or better connected. And if you resisted, that would only prove them right, that you were nothing more than trouble pretending to matter. You couldn't appeal to tradition. Tradition belonged to queens, to arranged marriages, to dynasties carefully constructed over bloodlines and alliances. You weren't part of that world. You were the interruption. Even the church turned away. They preached virtue, chastity, submission, but only for wives, widows, and virgins. You were none of those. So when your name was spoken, it came with a lowered voice, a slight sneer, a half-polite nod, a reminder that you weren't blessed, you were tolerated. And if something went wrong, if a child was born, if a rumor spread, if someone accused you of witchcraft or ambition or worse, there were no protections waiting, only doors that closed. At best, they sent you to a convent, a quiet place with cold floors and locked windows, where your days disappeared into prayer and your name into dust. At worst, they let you stay just long enough to humiliate you publicly before sending you out the servants' gate. Because you weren't family, not truly, you were temporary affection, a private indulgence, something beautiful, then silent, then gone. And no law, no book, no oath would come to your defense. You wouldn't last a day, not in a world where your suffering wasn't even considered unusual, just expected. You weren't loved, you were leveraged. In the quiet halls behind the throne, your name didn't mean you. It meant opportunity, a bargaining chip, a temporary offering wrapped in perfume and obedience. Sometimes, they gave you as a gift. Not officially, of course. There was no announcement. Just a quiet dinner where a visiting noble left looking particularly satisfied, and your room was empty the next morning. You weren't asked. You were informed. Or perhaps not even that. You might be sent to a rival court to keep the peace, or to a distant manor with a trusted ally, your presence meant to sweeten a deal or soothe an insult. If the politics were complicated, you became the soft apology dressed in lace. You could be replaced, repositioned, reassigned, because you didn't belong to yourself. You belonged to the arrangement, and the arrangement always came first. You weren't the only one, of course. The palace was full of women who had once meant something to someone, daughters of fallen houses, sisters of generals, cousins of bartered brides, and when their usefulness faded, so did their visibility. The queen had a seat at council. You had a seat on a carriage, headed somewhere you didn't choose. Sometimes you were kept, hidden in a villa near the border, dressed well, fed politely, smiled at just enough to keep you silent. Other times, you were traded again, passed from one patron to another, like a polite note passed across a table. And always, there was that word, honor. They spoke of protecting your honor as they moved you like livestock. They praised your discretion as they sold your silence. You were respected, but never listened to, trusted, but never consulted. If you protested, you were ungrateful. If you wept, you were dramatic. If you refused, you were difficult, and difficulties rarely lasted long in court. You might be given titles, lands, a new name to wear like a veil, but you knew what it meant, that your value wasn't in who you were, but what you could keep quiet. And when the next treaty needed mending, the next border calming, the next nobleman pacified, there'd be another you, waiting, listening, learning slowly how to become small enough to pass through locked doors without breaking. You wouldn't last a day, not when your body could become part of a treaty and your life a footnote to someone else's legacy. From the outside, the royal chambers looked serene, candlelight flickering across polished floors, velvet drapes swaying with the breeze, soft voices echoing like lullabies in marble corridors. But you didn't rest here. You survived. The royal harem, or its European equivalent, was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield without swords, where weapons were sewn into smiles and whispered into ears. You didn't fight with fists. You fought with glances, with posture, with the timing of your arrival, and the tilt of your head during supper. A word too warm, desperate. A silence too long, defiant. Every other woman was a rival. They might sit beside you at dinner, pluck fruit from your tray, braid your hair while humming. But behind those kind eyes were calculations. Who would be called tonight? Who had the king's ear? Whose perfume lingered longer in his chamber? There were no rules, only instincts, and everyone's sharpened quickly. The queen's ladies watched. Her chamberlain counted who entered what door and when. Even the cooks kept score, slipping extra honey to whoever smiled at the steward that morning. You learned quickly that kindness could be a trap, and pity a prelude to rumor. If the king lingered in your room 2 nights in a row, expect consequences. Maybe cold stares, maybe missing slippers, maybe a story slipped to the bishop about your unusual herbs. Everything mattered. You kept your voice soft but clear, your footsteps light but not rushed. You wore your best dress on the day the queen visited the gardens, because blending in was safer than standing out, but disappearing meant you were forgotten. Balance was everything, and balance was exhausting. Some women played the game better. They knew how to plant ideas without appearing manipulative, how to weep just enough to invite sympathy, but not suspicion. Others failed before they knew they'd entered a war. And when someone fell, no one helped. They just adjusted their gowns and moved one step closer to the king. You slept lightly. You hid letters in candle holders. You trusted no one, not even the maid who brushed your hair, not even the sister you arrived with, because one false word could send you to the countryside. One broken teacup could become a tale of hysteria. And through it all, you smiled. Because resting your eyes too long, walking too slowly, laughing at the wrong moment, that was all it took to become the next woman who used to be here. You wouldn't last a day, not when every corridor whispered your replacement before you even finished your tea. She saw you. Not just once, not just in passing. The queen always saw, even when she smiled, even when she nodded from across the great hall or asked you, ever so politely, how you were sleeping. She saw the way the king's eyes lingered half a second longer. She noticed the new gown, the sudden promotion of your brother, the bouquet left on your windowsill when no one was watching. And she didn't scream, she didn't accuse. She planned. Because a queen couldn't afford to be loud. Her power was quieter, colder, more permanent. She didn't need to lift a finger. There were others who would do it for her, ladies who owed her favours, priests who feared her wrath, stewards who knew better than to cross her line of sight. At first it was subtle, a missing hairpin, a cold glance from your usual maid, the way your meals arrived a little later, how the servants began avoiding your gaze, one by one. Then came the stories, that you'd used love potions, that you whispered in foreign tongues, that your family practiced strange rites on feast days, harmless rumours at first. But in a court filled with ears eager for scandal, even the smallest whisper had weight. You might be summoned, not by the king, but by a bishop, or worse, a healer, someone instructed to examine your mind, your soul, your loyalties. Or the queen might act through silence. She'd never mention your name, but when noble women spoke, they'd follow her cues. One by one, they'd stop inviting you, stop sitting near you, as if your shadow carried disease. You didn't fight back. You couldn't, because nothing was ever said directly. Nothing was written down. Just looks, just silence, just doors that no longer opened. And if you cried, that only confirmed their suspicions. If you remained calm, they'd say you were calculating. You were always too much, or not enough. And the queen, well, she remained above it all, draped in velvet, framed in stained glass, watched by saints carved in stone. But she didn't need to touch you to ruin you. Sometimes she simply invited a new girl to court, younger, softer, hungrier. Sometimes she just waited, because she knew the palace better than you ever would. She knew the walls had ears, and the candles listened, and she knew you wouldn't last. Not when even your stillness was seen as a threat. Not when every smile hid a strategy. Not when you shared space with a woman whose crown had nothing left to lose but her pride. You wouldn't last a day, not under a gaze sharpened by years of practice, and built to watch you fall in silence. You weren't supposed to carry a child. You could carry perfume, whispers, guilt, but not bloodlines. That was reserved for queens, for noble women with rings and witnesses and treaties signed in ink and wine. But sometimes it happened. The king stayed too long. The guards turned away, and one day you felt it. A shift, a flutter, something more than yours beneath your ribs. And that was when the silence changed. At first, no one said anything, but they knew. They always knew. The midwife arrived too early. The cook started changing your meals. A priest began passing by your corridor a little too often. Then came the visit. Not from the king, never from him, from someone else, a trusted woman of the court, or an older advisor, someone with kind eyes and cold hands, someone who sat beside you and spoke softly. They reminded you of duty, of balance, of how delicate the line was between peace and chaos. They said a child, your child, could disrupt everything. What if it were a boy? What if he lived? What if he claimed something no one was ready to give? There was no room for questions. You were told, not asked. Told what herbs to drink, when to drink them, how to pray, how to stay silent through the pain. Some girls obeyed, quietly, tearfully. Some didn't. They ran. They hid. They tried to carry the pregnancy in secret. But secrets don't survive in stone walls and thin hallways. And when resistance came, so did punishment. Isolation, reassignment, rumours. A sudden transfer to a countryside convent for your health. Sometimes the child was taken, not always violently, just quietly. You were told it was stillborn, that it wasn't meant to be, that it would have been a scandal, a mistake, a threat. Sometimes you weren't even told, just woken from sleep, aching and empty. And when you wept, no one answered, because crying for something that wasn't allowed to exist only made you foolish. No lullabies, no names, just silence. And if the child survived, hidden somewhere, passed to a wet nurse, marked as the baker's boy, or a foundling, you'd never know. You weren't allowed to know. Your womb didn't belong to you, it belonged to the throne. and the throne was very careful about what it claimed. You wouldn't last a day, not when even the smallest heartbeat inside you was considered a political liability. There was no farewell, no dramatic confrontation, no teary goodbye in candlelight, just absence. One day, you were there. The next, your chamber was empty, your name quietly scrubbed from the lips of those who once curtsied when you passed. When you fell from favor, it wasn't loud. It was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. The king simply stopped calling, and the court understood. Your meals arrived late, then stopped entirely. The servants who once fluffed your pillows no longer met your eyes. The seamstress forgot your measurements. Even the cat that used to curl at your feet found another lap. You weren't dismissed. You were erased. Sometimes they sent you to a convent, not as punishment at least, not officially, just for rest, for reflection, for spiritual renewal. You were escorted out a side gate. No procession, no escort, no one asking where you went. And sometimes you stayed, but behind doors that no one opened, in corners where the lamps burned lower, the walls felt colder, and no one knocked unless absolutely required. You became a ghost in your own palace. No one dared mention your name at dinner. No one whispered of what had happened, not because they didn't know, but because they did. And in that knowledge was fear. If it happened to you, it could happen to them. So they learned not to ask, not to linger too long near your old chamber, not to speak of how your favorite flower no longer grew in the garden. Your portraits, if any were ever made, were quietly removed, letters burned, trinkets redistributed. The scent of your perfume slowly faded from the drapes. And that was the point. Because a woman once favored could become a threat. She knew too much. She remembered too clearly, and worst of all, she had nothing left to lose. So you were forgotten, on purpose. And maybe, in some corner of the archives, your name still exists, buried in a servant's ledger, a passing mention in a noble's journal. The girl with the dark eyes, scribbled beside a date. But even that would fade. History has no patience for those who were inconvenient. And when they write of kings and queens, of wars and heirs, they won't mention you, not even in a footnote. You wouldn't last a day. Not in a world where being forgotten wasn't a tragedy. It was protocol. Not every mistress began poor. Some arrived with noble blood still warm in their veins, daughters of minor houses, cousins of fallen dukes, granddaughters of women who once hosted royal banquets. But noble blood doesn't always buy security. Wars happened, alliances shifted. One misstep by a father, one betrayal by an uncle, and suddenly, a girl who once danced in ballrooms now stood quietly at the edge of a king's corridor, waiting to be noticed. She wasn't chosen for love. She was convenient, available, polished just enough to avoid scandal, but desperate enough not to refuse. And so, she entered. Not as a guest, not as royalty, but as something else. Something harder to define. Too refined to be a servant, too tarnished to be a bride. She carried herself with practiced grace, still remembering how to curtsy properly, how to fold a letter with wax and ribbon, how to speak Latin prayers with the right pronunciation. But none of that mattered here. Here, she was just another woman in waiting. Waiting for a glance. Waiting for a summons. Waiting to forget who she used to be. She shared rooms with girls who had never seen a library, who didn't know which spoon to use at formal dinners. And still, it was the same. They were all equal now, invisible unless summoned, replaceable unless desired. Sometimes, the other girls whispered behind her back. She used to have a title. She had her own horse. She wore pearls at age 10. And perhaps she did, but pearls don't protect you in the king's chambers. They don't soften the silence after he leaves. She learned quickly that her past only made her fall harder, because people expected more from her, more composure, more obedience, less complaint. You should be grateful, they'd say. At least you were raised for this. But she hadn't been. Not for this. She'd been raised for arranged marriages and quiet gardens, not for half glances and whispered threats, not for being both ornament and secret. And when she disappeared, because she would, they all did, no one remembered her as a noble woman. They remembered her as that one, the proud girl, The one who used to speak 3 languages. The one who looked the queen in the eye a little too long. The one who forgot this place didn't care where you came from, only that you left without complaint. You wouldn't last a day. Not when even blue blood ran cold under palace stone. It never took much. A vial of herbs, a whispered prayer, a gaze held 1 second too long. That's all it took for someone to say the word. Which, not screamed, just suggested, softly, over wine, between sighs. She keeps dried flowers under her bed. She speaks to the moon. She never eats garlic. The court didn't need proof, only a story, one that made sense of things too hard to explain, like how a woman without a title gained the king's favour, or how the queen's candle kept flickering after she passed by. If your beauty lingered too long, if your health recovered too quickly, if your voice carried in the chapel, someone noticed. And when they noticed, they wondered. And when they wondered, you were already in danger. You didn't need to curse anyone. You just had to exist in a way that made people uncomfortable. Too quiet, too calm, too confident. Even kindness could turn against you. If you helped ease someone's fever with mint leaves and warm cloth, they'd thank you. But if that same person died weeks later of something entirely unrelated, suddenly your tea smelled suspicious. The word travelled faster than you could. Her eyes are too sharp. She never sneezes. She talks to birds. And it always started with a man, a priest, a steward, sometimes even a former lover who'd grown bored. They'd mention it casually, let it hang in the air. And others, eager, afraid, entertained, picked it up. No trial, just inquiry. A visit from someone with a cross and a list of questions. A change in how guards looked at you. The silence of your chambermaids. The way your food tasted just a little different, as if to remind you, your protection was gone. If it escalated, you didn't burn right away. That was for spectacle. First came isolation, then suspicion, then the removal of your things, your contacts, your voice. And sometimes, it never needed to go that far. Just the whisper was enough. Enough to justify your exile. Enough to explain your disappearance. Enough to wash the court's hands of you. They didn't need to destroy you. They only needed to make people stop trusting you. And once that was done, you faded. Not in fire, not in chains, but in the minds of those too frightened to say your name. You wouldn't last a day. Not when fear wore a rosary, and superstition was the court's most convenient excuse. Some tried. Not all mistresses were meek. Some came with sharp minds and sharper intentions. They'd seen the game, studied the players, and believed, truly believed, they could change the rules. They learned who listened, who talked too much over wine, who carried secrets folded inside their sleeves. They watched how power moved, like smoke, between halls, chambers, and confessional booths. And slowly, carefully, they stepped forward. One word here, a favour there, a name passed gently in the ear of someone important. They practiced invisibility, then chose moments to appear, like whispers shaped into form. Some even succeeded for a while. A royal decree delayed, a rival reassigned, a cousin promoted, a bishop silenced, tiny tremors in the palace structure, each one carefully placed. They were not queens, but sometimes, for a breathless moment, they felt like something close. But the court noticed. It always did. Power is tolerated when it knows its place. And a mistress with ideas? That was dangerous. She became ambitious, improper, a threat. The queen's circle tightened. The steward stopped relaying messages. Priests began praying a little louder near her chambers. Men who once listened leaned back in silence. And soon, the quiet warnings began. She was forgetting herself, speaking too much, overreaching. Then came the undoing. Whispers about her family's debts, questions about her loyalty, a late-night letter conveniently discovered in the wrong hands. No shouting, no public accusation, just a shift. The people who once owed her favours suddenly remembered they didn't. The guards stopped saluting. The servants paused longer before answering her bell. The king? He found new interests. And she? She began to vanish. Not all at once, a piece at a time. Her influence, her allies, her privileges, taken like chess pieces, quietly, without spectacle, because no one likes a mistress who forgets her place. Even if she played the game well, it didn't matter. The board was never hers to win, it was only ever hers to survive. And most didn't. They ended up in small manors far from court, or locked away in quiet convents with locked gardens, or simply erased, their names used as cautionary tales. Don't be like her. She got too clever. She wanted too much. You wouldn't last a day. Not when ambition in a woman was seen as a sin, and punished like one. They told you to be pure, to be humble, obedient, silent, to lower your eyes in prayer, and lift your hands in service. The church spoke often of virtue, how it clothed women better than silk, how it protected like armor, how it pleased God more than anything else. But that was never meant for you. You weren't a wife. You weren't a nun. You didn't wear the white veil of innocence or the gold ring of holy matrimony. You existed in the grey space no sermon ever named. They called you temptation. Not directly, just enough. Enough to make the priests avoid your eyes. Enough to make the chapel door feel like a test. Enough to remind you, again and again, that forgiveness wasn't written for your kind. You could confess your sins, but not your sorrow. You could kneel in penance, but not ask for mercy. You could pray, but never be seen praying. Because virtue, in those days, was about appearances, and yours didn't fit. You were judged for the place you were forced into, condemned for the gaze you couldn't refuse, punished for proximity, for survival, for doing what others had asked of you. Men were excused, always. A king could keep 10 women and still be called God's anointed. A priest could whisper forgiveness to nobles between wars and wine. But you, alone, afraid, adorned in whatever was chosen for you, were the cautionary tale. They said you led men astray. They said your smile was too knowing. They said your steps disturbed the sanctity of sacred halls. And so, religion became another wall, another mouth that did not speak for you. The scriptures were quoted at you, never for you. Verses twisted into cages, parables bent into punishments. Woman is the gateway to sin. Eve reached first. Redemption comes through silence. You listened. You tried to be still, but stillness wasn't enough. Not when every breath you took without permission was seen as arrogance. They told you to be holy, but they would not let you, because holiness required dignity, and dignity had already been taken. You weren't a soul in need of saving. You were a problem in need of erasing. You wouldn't last a day. Not in a world where salvation was for the visible, and you had already been pushed into shadow. Some doors didn't open again. Not because someone locked them, but because the person behind them chose not to step out anymore. They say a few women went quietly. One day they were brushing their hair by candlelight. The next, the room was still. The cup of wine untouched. The ink on the final letter still wet. They didn't scream. They didn't leave notes dripping with drama or accusations. Most didn't leave notes at all. What was there left to say? That they were tired? That the weight became too quiet to carry? That disappearing on purpose felt more dignified than being erased slowly by others. No one held a funeral. The court didn't wear black. The king wasn't informed until days later, if at all. The palace simply adjusted. The servants reassigned. The bedding changed. The name unspoken. And someone new arrived. There were wells, tucked behind old kitchens. There were vials, hidden in sleeves. There were herbs, once meant to bring calm, now repurposed for silence. They didn't do it out of heartbreak. Not always. Some did it because the rumours had grown too sharp, because a child had been taken, because the Queen's eyes never stopped watching, because the priests began visiting too often, and their prayers felt like judgment. Others did it before they were sent away, to convents with locked doors, to distant manors with no visitors. They wanted to choose the end before the world did it for them. And some simply couldn't bear the noise inside their own heads anymore, the echo of footsteps that never came, the silence after the king stopped calling, the way people stopped saying their name in full. They weren't saints, they weren't martyrs, they were just women who had run out of exits. And history didn't remember them kindly, if remembered at all. Their deaths were chalked up to illness, to nerves, to female frailty, a convenient phrase here, a half-truth there. Nobody asked questions. Not really, because to ask would mean admitting they had once been part of the story, and the palace preferred its stories clean. So the curtains were drawn, the ink was dried, and by the time anyone thought to miss them, they were already fading into legend, or worse, into nothing. You wouldn't last a day. Not when the most control you'd ever have was the choice of how and when to disappear. Let's say you survived. Not everyone vanished in the night. Not every mistress died in silence or slipped into shadow. Some endured, quietly, carefully. You aged. Your face changed. The king's attention moved elsewhere, and slowly, the court stopped looking at you with curiosity or contempt. They stopped looking altogether. You were no longer a threat, just a memory no one quite wanted to bring up. You might have been moved to a distant estate, given a modest allowance, allowed to live out your days with embroidery, tepid tea, and windows that overlooked nothing. Sometimes you were even allowed to speak again, at dinner, at confession, to visiting nobles who didn't remember who you were, or pretended not to. And in those moments, you almost believed you'd escaped the worst of it. But survival didn't mean recognition. You weren't written into the royal histories. You weren't included in the family trees. Your name, if mentioned, was wrapped in euphemism. A favourite, a companion, a quiet influence during the king's middle years. If you were lucky, you became a whisper in the margin. If not, you became someone else entirely. Your story was reshaped, turned into caution, or scandal, or myth. They said you plotted, or seduced, or bewitched. They made you cleverer than you were, crueler than you ever dared to be, more dramatic than the quiet truth of how you simply endured. Sometimes, they took your story and gave it to someone else, a younger woman, a more acceptable one, or they blended your life with another's, until even the scholars stopped remembering which of you lived where, and why. Even your face blurred. A painting in a hallway no longer bore your name, just anonymous court lady. A letter found in an archive might carry your handwriting, but no one could confirm it. The voice was familiar, but unclaimed. And that was the worst part. Not the exile, not the silence, not even the loneliness, but the knowing, deep, persistent, that you had once shaped something real, that you had existed, felt, fought, loved, and no one would remember. Not truly. They would remember what they needed, what fit, what was convenient. You, as you were, didn't fit the story, so they trimmed the edges, adjusted the colours, smoothed the contradictions. And by the time someone asked, "Who was she?" no one could answer. You wouldn't last a day, not when even survival was a kind of disappearance. Written in someone else's handwriting, you'll find them scattered in dusty chronicles, tucked between the names of kings and generals, some carved faintly into stone, some lingering in letters that somehow weren't burned. Agnes, Isabel, Cecilia of something. They were the exceptions, the ones who caused enough of a stir, or stayed just long enough, to be remembered, not for who they were, but for what they represented. A scandal, a war, a rumour too juicy to die. Even then, their names didn't belong to them anymore. History borrowed them, reshaped them, turned them into metaphors or morality tales. She bewitched the king. She brought ruin to the court. She was beautiful, and that was her downfall. But the others, the vast majority, they had no name left. They were a mistress, a concubine, the woman who once lived in the West Wing. Their faces blurred, their stories folded into each other like pages in a burned book. They became a collective, an anonymous crowd of shadows who passed through power without ever owning it. Even those who had once worn pearls, once danced in candlelight, once bore royal blood, lost to time, one breath at a time. And it wasn't an accident. It was designed. The palace recorded births, marriages, treaties, not feelings, not compromises, not the girls who sat beside the fire and waited to be wanted. They weren't meant to be remembered. That was part of the unspoken deal. You were allowed to exist, briefly, but only as long as no one expected you to leave a mark. So the world moved on. New queens were crowned, new names carved into church walls, new songs written for different women, with titles and airs and stories that were safe to retell. And maybe, somewhere, a child grew up not knowing who their mother truly was. Maybe a servant whispered a name once, only to forget it by morning. Maybe you stood by a window one evening and thought, I used to be someone, but no one was there to answer. You wouldn't last a day, not because you were weak, but because the world was built to forget women like you. And forgetting is the final erasure. Long after you stopped being seen, long after your voice faded from the halls, your name, your true name, would be the last thing to vanish, and no one would notice it was gone. So now you know. Being a royal mistress wasn't silk and roses. It wasn't candlelit romance or secret power behind the throne. It was silence. It was sacrifice. It was survival. You weren't a queen. You weren't a villain. You weren't even a story worth telling, unless someone else needed a cautionary tale. You were seen, then discarded, wanted, then feared, named, then forgotten. And yet, you endured. Not for glory, not for love, but because there was nowhere else to go. No path forward, no place to return. Just long corridors, soft footsteps, and a life lived half in shadow. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of them, the women who lived in palaces but never held power, who smiled quietly, knowing history would never remember their names. You wouldn't last a day. And somehow, they did. If you're used to Googling anything you want at any time of day, this might be difficult to imagine. But in ancient Greece, knowledge wasn't for everyone. It wasn't even for most people. And it most definitely wasn't for women. Greece, the land of philosophers, mathematicians, and celestial theories. You've probably heard the names Pythagoras, Aristotle, Plato, men debating under marble columns, arguing about the cosmos, reason, and ethics. Their words were copied, studied, and passed down for thousands of years. But here's the part that doesn't usually get printed in textbooks. Women were not part of that conversation. In fact, most Greek women weren't even allowed in the room. Education, especially formal learning, was reserved for boys born into the right families. They were taught to read, write, count, and think. Girls, on the other hand, were trained to be obedient, to marry young, to bear children, to stay quiet. If you were a woman in Athens, your life was largely confined to the home. The walls of your house were your boundaries, and stepping outside too often could lead to gossip, or worse. There were no schools waiting to teach you philosophy or mathematics. There were no scrolls with your name on them. Your opinions, if you had any, were best kept to yourself. And yet, somehow, one woman changed that. She was born into a house unlike most, a family that, for reasons we'll never fully know, taught their daughter to read. Not just to read, but to question, to observe the skies, to draw the stars, to think. It's difficult to overstate how unusual this was. To put it in modern terms, imagine being the only woman in your entire country allowed to attend school. Then imagine being told that everything you learn might one day be used to accuse you of witchcraft. Because that's how it worked. A woman with knowledge was both admired and feared. She might be consulted in private, but in public she was often ridiculed, suspected, or erased. In ancient Greece, the idea of a woman advising a king based on astronomical calculations wasn't just rare, it was revolutionary and dangerous. You wouldn't last a day in her sandals. Let's say you somehow made it past childhood in good health. You weren't married off by age 14, and you found a father or brother willing to teach you the movement of stars, the math of orbits, the rhythm of time. Now imagine trying to use that knowledge. You step outside with a scroll in your hand. People stare. You open your mouth to explain a planetary alignment. The silence thickens. Someone mutters, "Witch." Another asks why you aren't home, sewing. This was not a society that welcomed women's voices, especially not in matters of science, politics, or the divine. You could chart the heavens perfectly, but still be burned by the fire of tradition. The woman we speak of, whose name was either forgotten or never written, lived in the cracks of history, between what was allowed and what was possible. She didn't just defy social roles. She rewrote them, quietly, dangerously. And she didn't do it to make history. She did it because she couldn't help but see patterns in the sky. Because the movement of Jupiter meant something. Because the stars whispered truth. To survive, she had to walk a careful line. She couldn't be too visible, or too confident, or too loud. She advised in shadows. She wrote in secret. She passed knowledge to students one whisper at a time. She lived with the constant awareness that any day might be the day someone came knocking, not for advice, but to accuse. In today's world, you might call her a scholar, an astrologer, maybe even a scientist. In her own time, she was simply strange, unnatural, out of place. So the next time your Wi-Fi goes down and you're frustrated about not being able to finish your astrology podcast, remember, she looked at the same stars, with far more danger and far fewer rights. You wouldn't last a day in her world, but she lasted a lifetime in yours. History is full of names. Kings, generals, philosophers. They are carved in stone, printed in books, recited in classrooms. But this woman's name? It was never meant to be remembered. Some say she was called Theosebia. Others think she might have been a shadow in the life of Hypatia of Alexandria, a famed philosopher who was herself torn apart by a mob. But the truth is, we don't know for sure. We don't have her full name, or a portrait, or a statue. What we have are fragments, footnotes, a passing reference in someone else's scroll, a mention that someone, somewhere, had the audacity to read the stars, and was a woman. And in the ancient world, that was more than enough to be forgotten on purpose. She was likely born into a family different from most. Not noble, not royal, but bold. A household where books were not hidden from daughters, where stars were not off limits, where knowledge was passed down not just through sons, but through silence, eye contact, and trust. Imagine being a child in such a house. The neighbors whisper, the priests frown, and yet, inside, at the kitchen table by candlelight, your father traces constellations on parchment. You ask questions, he answers, and just like that, a dangerous thing is born. A girl who thinks. She wasn't raised to marry rich. She was raised to understand Saturn's orbit. But outside that home, the world was watching, and it was not amused. In that time, a woman who could read was suspicious. A woman who wrote was dangerous. A woman who predicted political outcomes based on the stars? She might as well have carried a sign that read, "Heretic." And yet, she persisted. No throne, no title, no place in official records. She operated in the margins, by word of mouth, by trust and secrecy. She kept her scrolls rolled tight. She stored them in locked boxes or behind loose stones in the wall. Every diagram of planetary movement had to be disguised as decoration. Every note about eclipses folded behind laundry, tucked inside herbs. She lived in constant awareness that the wrong person reading the right sentence could mean the end, because her knowledge, so rare, so exact, was not something the world knew what to do with. Too precise for folklore, too mystical for science, too feminine for philosophy. She did not teach in amphitheatres. She did not speak in the town square. She didn't have the luxury of shouting her ideas into the air. Instead, her voice came quietly, through apprentices, through maps passed from hand to hand. If someone asked for help, they came at night, always at night. They knocked softly. She opened the door, just a crack. There were no greetings, only a candle, a question, and the turning of pages. Sometimes it was a nervous politician asking if the war should wait. Sometimes it was a soldier, looking for a sign before crossing the sea. But her name was never spoken in daylight, because to speak her name was to admit she existed. And if she existed, people would start to ask questions. And if people asked too many questions, someone would get nervous. She was tolerated, as long as she was invisible. You wouldn't last a day in her place. Not just because of the danger, but because of the silence, the way your words would have to be carefully chosen, the way your knowledge would have to wear a disguise, the way your life would depend on your ability to appear harmless while knowing everything. She knew what it meant to live on the edge of a knife. She knew that power and invisibility were often the same thing. And yet, she kept going, not because she wanted glory, but because the stars wouldn't stop calling. To know the sky and say nothing was worse than any punishment. In the end, she left behind very little that could be traced. No monument, no published work, just whispers. And in those whispers, a legacy that refuses to disappear. Somewhere, in the margins of a dusty book, a student wrote, "She knew the movement of Mars better than any man." That's all. No name. Just a quiet, unshakable truth. And in some ways, that's all she needed. Because even without a name, her story survived. And now, so has yours, for knowing it. Today, when we hear the word astrology, we usually think of zodiac memes, personality quizzes, and vague predictions printed on the back of a magazine. But in the ancient world, especially in the time of early Greece and its surrounding cultures, astrology wasn't seen as entertainment. It wasn't magic. It wasn't even mystical. It was math. It was observation, calculation, and record-keeping. It was the study of patterns too large for one lifetime to witness, yet too precise to be ignored. To people like her, the woman we've been following, the stars were data points, and the sky, it was a kind of spreadsheet written in light. Let's be clear, she didn't flip tarot cards. She didn't stir cauldrons or chant under the moon. She charted celestial movement using long tables. She tracked planetary orbits by hand. She cross-referenced eclipses with rainfall. She understood that Jupiter's retrograde wasn't a feeling. It was a phenomenon, measured to the minute. If you saw her work, you might mistake it for astronomy. And in many ways, it was. Because back then, the line between astronomy and astrology had not yet been drawn. They were one and the same. One was the study of where the stars were. The other was the attempt to understand what that might mean. And while we might separate those things today, she couldn't. Not because she was unscientific, but because she was living in a world where science was still being born. You wouldn't last a day doing what she did. Not because it was dangerous, although it was, but because it was exhausting. Every night, she worked by candlelight or starlight, often in silence. She marked star positions using rudimentary tools. No telescopes, no software, just her eyes, her notes, and a deep patience most of us have never practiced. She read the sky the way others read sacred texts. And the stars, in return, told her stories of time, of possibility, of risk. For her, a slowing planet wasn't superstition. It was caution. She once looked at the movement of Jupiter, slow, stuttering, unusually hesitant, and told a visiting nobleman, "Do not attack. The sky is uncertain." He listened. He waited. And days later, a surprise storm devastated the very region he had planned to invade. That wasn't a lucky guess. That was data. Not divine inspiration, but deduction. And still, she was careful with her words. She never claimed to predict fate. She simply pointed to the heavens and said, "Something's not right." Her predictions were not prophecy. They were probability. That made her dangerous, because kings began to listen, not to priests, not to generals, but to her. And even though her face was never shown on coins, and her words were never written into law, she influenced decisions that changed history. Quietly, anonymously, and often, reluctantly. You wouldn't last a day in her world of calculations, because the pressure was immense. A single mistake, one misread planet, one misaligned date, could ruin crops, or delay treaties, or end wars prematurely. And if that happened, she would not be gently corrected. She would be blamed, publicly, harshly, because in a world that didn't quite understand where knowledge ended and sorcery began, being wrong was not just embarrassing. It was fatal. So she checked and rechecked. She watched the skies not for beauty, but for precision. While others saw constellations shaped like animals, she saw angles, arcs, inclinations. Her drawings looked less like mythology, more like geometry homework. Lines connecting dots, figures within figures. When people called her a mystic, she winced. She wasn't trying to be spiritual. She was trying to be accurate. And that's why she never published her work. She passed it quietly to students, one page at a time. Because astrology, to her, was never meant to be spectacle. It was survival. It helped rulers avoid war. It helped farmers plant at the right time. It helped societies prepare for drought or flood. It was predictive modeling, centuries before computers. And though she didn't use the term science, that's exactly what it was. Observation, pattern, conclusion, all done in a world where just holding a pen as a woman made you suspicious. So the next time someone asks, "Do you believe in astrology?" you might think of her not as a fortune teller, but as a sky reader. Someone who found patterns in the stars long before the modern world caught up. Someone who listened to the universe with discipline, not wonder, and translated it into action. In her hands, the stars weren't symbols. They were signals. And she, quietly, precisely, became the first to decode them. She never sat on a throne. She never wore a crown. And yet, the people who did listened to her. She was the kind of person kings visited in secret. Not in grand halls with trumpets and guards, but in quiet corridors. Late at night, when the sky was clear and the stars were bright and doubts began to whisper, you wouldn't find her name in royal records. No mention in treaties. No portrait on palace walls. But if you traced the events, wars that were delayed, marriages that were arranged, journeys suddenly cancelled, you'd begin to see her fingerprints. She was a ghost in the margins of power, and she was always watching the sky. You wouldn't last a day doing what she did, not because it was hard work, though it was, but because it required an impossible balance, to be seen just enough to be useful, but not so much as to be feared. The rulers of her time lived in a world balanced on anxiety. Every storm was an omen, every birth defect, a curse, every eclipse, a sign. And yet, behind the curtain of all that fear stood someone who actually understood what the heavens were doing, not because she believed in gods pulling levers, but because she measured the movements with her own hand. But that knowledge came at a cost. If she was too accurate, she was suspicious. If she was too vague, she was dismissed. If she was too visible, she was dangerous. So she learned to whisper, not speak, to suggest, not declare. And kings learned to knock quietly. They didn't bring scrolls. They brought silence. And questions. What does Saturn's delay mean for our harvest? Should I wait before sending troops to the east? Is it safe to marry before the full moon? And she would answer, carefully, cautiously, not because she didn't know, but because she did. She had seen what happened to those who knew too much, especially women. You wouldn't last a day in her position, because her very survival depended on staying invisible. She couldn't correct a priest in public. She couldn't challenge a general's confidence. She couldn't even sign her name boldly at the bottom of her own work. The risk was too high. A single accusation, "She knows too much," could lead to exile. Or worse. So she became a shadow, moving through corridors only when summoned, speaking only when asked. She had no title. She owned no land. But her influence seeped quietly into the cracks of history. The most powerful men in the kingdom might never say her name aloud. But when they made decisions, her voice echoed just behind theirs. Even those who doubted her couldn't ignore her, because time and time again, she was right. And sometimes, terrifyingly right. There's a story, half legend, half truth, of a king who ignored her warning. She told him to delay his voyage across the sea. She saw something unusual in the skies. A misalignment, a pressure, a silence. He left anyway. 3 days later, a storm tore through the coast. His fleet was shattered. He returned, soaked in salt and regret. He didn't say thank you, but he sent her a gold ring. She melted it down. She didn't do this for reward. She did it because it was the only way to speak, when women weren't allowed to. Even her students were few, and carefully chosen. She taught them quietly, privately, and always with the same warning: this knowledge is not for fame, it's for survival. because she knew something we often forget. That being close to power is not the same as being safe. She was useful, yes, but always expendable. The moment her predictions made someone uncomfortable, the moment a rival accused her of heresy, the moment a high priest felt threatened by her knowledge, she would be abandoned. No defense, no trial, just silence. You wouldn't last a day under that kind of pressure. And yet, she lasted years, because she knew how to disappear when needed, how to let others take credit, how to avoid the spotlight while illuminating others. She had memorized the balance. Too important to ignore, too invisible to fear. She knew how to walk that razor's edge, and she did it not for glory, but because she believed in what she knew. She believed the stars had patterns, and those patterns had meaning, and someone needed to read them, even if no one ever remembered who she was, even if she had to live and die in the shadows, because the sky didn't care about titles, or palaces, or power. It simply moved, and she moved with it. She didn't wear robes of gold. She didn't walk through marble courtyards with guards at her side. But somehow, when she entered a room, people fell silent. Some stood out of quiet respect, others out of quiet fear. Because when a woman knows something she's not supposed to, people talk. You wouldn't last a day under that kind of attention. At first, it was admiration. She had a mind that cut through confusion. She explained the stars in ways that even merchants could understand. She predicted shifts in weather, in power, in fate, and when her words came true, again and again, people noticed. They called her the Star Watcher. They sent gifts to her doorstep, a loaf of honey bread, a bundle of figs, a letter tucked into linen that simply read, "Thank you, you were right." But respect, when it's mixed with ignorance, doesn't always stay pure. Soon, the whispers began. She never married. She works alone at night. I heard she writes in a language no one else understands. Some said she was blessed. Others said she was cursed. Most weren't sure what to believe. You wouldn't last a day being watched like that, praised in the morning, questioned by evening. She lived in a strange middle space, too clever to be dismissed, too strange to be fully accepted. In the market, women looked at her with quiet awe. They wondered how she knew so much. Some brought their sick children, hoping she could help. She never claimed to be a healer, but they still came. Men, meanwhile, were more divided. Some asked questions, real questions, about the stars, the seasons, the meaning of dreams. Others simply wanted to prove her wrong. They'd bring her flawed calculations, hoping to catch her in a mistake. She corrected them, politely, and they didn't come back. But not everyone challenged her openly. Most just whispered. One woman, so learned, so still, so separate, what else could she be if not unnatural? She became a myth while still alive. She sees things. She speaks with wind. She hears voices no one else can hear. Of course, none of that was true. She didn't conjure. She calculated. She didn't cast spells. She studied shadows. But facts rarely matter when fear enters the room. You wouldn't last a day with that kind of rumor wrapped around your name. Still, she never tried to defend herself. She knew that any argument would only give the whispers more volume. So she stayed silent, and she wrote, and she watched. But the respect didn't go away. It just became complicated. Officials who mocked her in public still sent servants to her door after sunset. Priests who preached against sky magic still glanced upward when clouds moved too fast. Even her harshest critics paused when she looked at the horizon too long, because part of them wondered, what did she see that they didn't? There's something uncomfortable about a woman who knows too much. Something threatening, especially in a world built on the comfort of men always knowing more. And yet, she never flaunted her knowledge. She simply carried it, like a stone in her pocket. Weighty, private, unbreakable. You wouldn't last a day under that weight, because hers was not the weight of pride. It was the weight of being needed, but never fully trusted. Of being the last person they called when things went wrong, but the first one they blamed when things stayed wrong. Still, she kept working, because she believed the stars told the truth, even when people didn't. And the more she studied, the more careful she became. Her scrolls were no longer left in the open. She wrapped them in oilskin and hid them behind bricks. She stopped using ink that was easy to read. She created symbols that only her students could understand, because admiration can turn into accusation in the blink of an eye. And by now, she'd heard too many stories of wise women accused of sorcery, of scholars denounced by their own students, of scrolls burned while still wet with ink. So she prepared. She made copies. She gave them to 3 apprentices. She whispered the same words to each one. If I disappear, the stars must still be read. Not shouted, not sold, just read. Because her goal had never been fame. It had been continuity. A quiet belief that someone, someday, would look up at the sky and understand. But in her own time, the sky was starting to close. The church was rising. The temples were watching. And the line between curiosity and heresy was fading fast. You wouldn't last a day walking that line. But she did, year after year, step by step, whisper by whisper, respected, feared, misunderstood, always between light and shadow, and yet, always looking up. She never called them books, not out loud. In her voice, they were simply records, or weather notes, or sky accounts. Nothing threatening, nothing mystical, just ordinary words for something that, in truth, was not ordinary at all. They were her life's work. 20 volumes, maybe more. Each one handwritten, each one carefully bound, and none of them meant for the public eye. You wouldn't last a day carrying what those books held. To the untrained eye, they looked like nonsense, rows of symbols, looping diagrams, planetary notations. But to those who knew her system, each page was precise. Each line was tied to the movement of stars, the turning of seasons, the rise and fall of rulers. Her books predicted droughts, marked eclipses, traced patterns in war and weather alike. They were not spells. They were sequences, long chains of if this then that, based not on faith, but on repetition. And yet, that didn't make them safe, because knowledge that explains the world can threaten those who claim to control it. So she hid them, not in a grand library, not in a temple vault, but in pieces, tucked under floorboards, sealed in clay jars, hidden behind false bricks. She never kept them in one place. Too risky, too easy to lose everything at once. You wouldn't last a day playing that kind of chess, because every day she woke up wondering, what if someone finds one? She taught her apprentices how to copy them, slowly, by candlelight, page by page, never 2 working on the same volume, never in the same room. If asked, they would say they were copying poetry, or old merchant ledgers. But they knew, and more importantly, they knew the rule. Never let the church see. It wasn't superstition. It was strategy, because the tide was turning. The temples were rising in power, and anything that couldn't be found in scripture was starting to be called unnatural. Her maps of the sky? They were beginning to look like portals to suspicion. Her books, like invitations to heresy. So she gave a warning, not in anger, not in fear, just in certainty. One night, she gathered her 3 most trusted students. She placed her hand over the last completed book, and she said, simply, "Don't let them burn this." That was all. Not a plea, not a speech, just a fact, because she had seen it happen too many times. Books disappearing, scrolls reduced to ash, names erased. She didn't expect to be remembered. She only hoped her work would survive. You wouldn't last a day holding that hope, because the world around her was darkening. Whispers had grown louder. She noticed people watching her door, questions being asked too casually. Someone at the temple had mentioned her name, and that was enough. She began preparing to vanish. The books were separated, trusted to different hands, marked with discreet signs so they could be reassembled, someday, if needed. She burned her working notes, erased diagrams from her walls, removed names from the margins of her pages, not out of fear, but out of caution, because she knew the work might outlive her, but only if no one connected it to her face. You wouldn't last a day making yourself disappear. But she did. Quietly, almost invisibly, she stepped backward. She stopped taking visitors. She no longer answered questions about eclipses or storms. She went silent, except with her students, and with her books. The books that now lived in satchels and cellars, jars and cloth. The books that carried star paths and warnings and instructions, and her final words, written in the back of the last volume. If you must choose between my name and the pages, choose the pages. Because she knew names could be erased. But knowledge, if protected, could survive. She didn't expect her apprentices to save her story. She only asked that they protect the ideas, that they guard the sky's language until it was safe to speak it again. And so, the books disappeared. Not forever. Just long enough. Long enough to slip past the reach of the fires. Long enough to survive the silence. Long enough to reach someone like you. Someone reading quietly. Someone wondering where this all came from. Someone realizing, maybe for the first time, that science and secrecy have always walked together. You wouldn't last a day with 20 volumes of forbidden knowledge in your hands. But she did, because she believed in the stars, and because she believed that someone, somewhere, someday, would read them again. No one agrees on how she died. Some say it was quiet, a slow illness, a breath that simply didn't come one morning. Others whisper something darker, a poisoned drink, a cup offered in ritual, passed from hands that did not tremble. Not by accident, they say, but as a warning. Still others claim she vanished completely, slipped into the woods, fled under moonlight, left no body, no grave, no last word. The truth, as with most stories like hers, is buried, not just by time, but by intention. You wouldn't last a day in a world where your death wasn't yours to control or remember, because what came after was very clear. One morning, the door to her house stood open, not broken, just ajar, as if someone had entered and never returned, or as if someone had left, never planning to come back. The neighbors watched, but said nothing. Later that week, men from the temple arrived. They moved quietly, with rolled-up sleeves and unreadable faces. They walked the perimeter. They collected what little remained. No scrolls, no maps, no star diagrams on the walls. Those had already been hidden or destroyed. But they did find one thing, a jar of ash, still warm, still scented faintly with ink and beeswax. Someone, it seemed, had burned something important, but not everything. You wouldn't last a day under the weight of that kind of silence, because when the church decides to erase someone, they don't start with the person. They start with the story. They spoke of her once, briefly, in sermon. They said she had fallen into error, that she had trusted the stars more than the heavens, and that such a path led only to darkness. Her name was not spoken again, but her students knew better. They had already scattered the books, already remembered the warning, already closed their mouths and opened their eyes. One of them wrote, quietly, in the margin of an old text, "She is gone. The books are safe. The sky remembers." That's all. No signature, no emotion, just a record. Because grief, in a time of fire, must travel quietly. You wouldn't last a day grieving like that. Not openly, not loudly, just in glances, in silence, in care. But even though she was gone, the consequences remained. The temple tightened its grip. Star charts were banned. Scrolls showing planetary alignments were seized. Whispers of sky women were met with suspicion, then with sentencing. For years, her students pretended to forget. They practiced normal trades. They married, moved, changed names. But the books stayed hidden. Pages tucked inside loaves of bread. Maps folded between layers of dye in fabric bundles. Equations carved onto the backs of wooden combs, mistaken for decoration. Because knowledge doesn't vanish. It waits. The church believed the threat was gone. They had seen no rebellion, no uprising, just one woman, and now, not even that. But consequences don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just sit, quiet, patient, smouldering beneath history. And slowly, across decades, then centuries, her story began to surface again. Not through official records, but in fragments. A footnote in a monastery ledger, a strange symbol that appeared in 3 books, written in 3 different towns, a weather prediction too accurate to be guesswork, and always, somewhere in the margins, a note about someone who had once watched the stars and understood. You wouldn't last a day holding that legacy, because it's not the kind of story that offers comfort. It doesn't end with justice, or with a statue, or with an apology from the people who tried to erase her. It ends with quiet defiance, with secret knowledge, with the recognition that sometimes survival isn't about being seen. It's about planting something no one can dig up. In her case, that something was understanding. That the stars do move with rhythm. That power doesn't always come with a crown. And that erasure is never complete, not when ideas are passed hand to hand. So her death, whether quiet or violent or chosen, didn't succeed in ending her. Because every time someone reads an old book and finds something odd in the margins, every time a strange diagram appears that doesn't fit the rest, every time a story surfaces about a woman who read the sky and disappeared, she lives again, in shadows, in questions, in doubt, and in that doubt, power. You wouldn't last a day walking through that doubt, but she did, and in doing so, she gave us a path. Not easy, not safe, but still lit, faintly, by stars. It's easy to believe that knowledge is always a good thing, that books are sacred, that learning is progress. But that's now. There was a time, and not just once, when knowledge was dangerous, when questions were crimes, and when books were burned, not for what they got wrong, but for what they got right. You wouldn't last a day in that kind of world, because in her time, truth wasn't measured by accuracy. It was measured by obedience. If your knowledge fit within the accepted order, fine. If it stepped outside, even a little, even quietly, it became a threat. And so her books, even with no curses, no spells, no politics, were marked for destruction. Not because they were evil, but because they worked. They explained things that weren't supposed to be explained, predicted things that weren't supposed to be predicted, and proved, gently, silently, and irrefutably, that the universe didn't need permission to be understood. That scared people, especially people in power, because the moment a book teaches someone to see for themselves, it also teaches them to question what they've been told. And that, in the eyes of the church, was heresy. You wouldn't last a day under those conditions. The flames didn't start suddenly. They began with rumors. Soft, uncertain, but growing. Her maps show the sky as mechanical. She writes of planets as if they move without God's will. She draws diagrams without any saints in them. Soon, scrolls like hers were gathered in bundles. No trial, no debate, just orders. Burn them. Why? Because they weren't written by men of faith. Because they didn't mention scripture. Because they worked too well. To the church, her books weren't scrolls. They were escape routes. And escape routes must be sealed. So they set fires. Not just in temples, but in fields, in alleyways, in courtyards behind stone walls. A student might carry a book for months, hidden beneath food or laundry, only to have it taken in a raid. No questioning, no chance to explain, just ash. Because ash doesn't argue. You wouldn't last a day carrying something the world wants to forget. But she had, and now her students had to choose. Protect the books, or protect themselves. Some did both. Some failed. But the warning had already been given. If you must choose between my name and the pages, choose the pages. Because names could be erased. But knowledge, once planted, could grow again. Still, what was lost mattered. Entire volumes gone. Charts that took decades to draw. gone in minutes. Observations that had no copies. Equations that had no key. Ink that melted into smoke. We can't know what was in those pages, but we know what kind of fear they caused. And that tells us something. You don't burn what you don't fear. The church claimed they were protecting souls. But really, they were protecting control. Because if a woman with no title could predict the movement of planets, what else might she predict? And if a girl read her words and understood the patterns, what else might she question? A book is a door, and hers were doors to a universe that didn't need a priest to explain it. That was enough. So they burned them. And in doing so, they tried to burn the possibility that someone, someday, might see the sky differently. But fire doesn't destroy everything. Some students fled with pages sewn into their sleeves. Others memorized diagrams, copying them later by hand. A few left coded messages in other books, so subtle, so quiet, no one noticed for years. And though many were lost, a few survived. Tattered, incomplete, but alive. Pages that later scholars would find centuries later, puzzled by the precision. A lunar cycle predicted to the hour. A climate pattern noted 3 generations before the first instrument. A planetary alignment tied to the rise and fall of a king. These weren't guesses. They were records. Carefully gathered. Brilliantly connected. And undeniably hers. Even if her name had vanished. You wouldn't last a day fighting that kind of erasure. But she hadn't fought with swords or sermons. She'd fought with silence. With ink. With the stubborn belief that the sky belonged to anyone willing to look. That's what they tried to burn. Not just books, but the idea that truth could live outside permission. So the next time someone tells you history is a neat line of progress, remember her books, and the hands that hid them, and the fires that feared them. Because knowledge, it turns out, isn't always welcome, especially when it shines too brightly in the dark. There are no statues of her, no temples in her name, no golden seal pressed into parchment to mark her as scholar, or sage, or seer. Her face was never carved in marble. Her voice was never recorded. Her name, whatever it once was, has been lost. And yet, something remains. Not in her own books. Those are gone. Burned, buried, erased. But in the margins of other books, her fingerprints appear. You wouldn't notice them unless you knew where to look. A curious symbol, a phrase that doesn't match the style of the rest. A reference to a chart that no longer exists. A footnote about an unnamed woman of the stars. She was never the author, only a whisper behind the text. You wouldn't last a day being remembered that way. Part ghost, part question. But even ghosts can leave echoes. Over the centuries, a pattern has emerged. In the notebooks of medieval monks, in the personal journals of astronomers, in commentaries written on top of older scrolls. Ideas that shouldn't be there, but are. Too advanced, too precise, too similar to one another to be coincidence. One chart appears in 3 different countries, in 3 different centuries, nearly identical. No source, no author, just there. A technique for predicting solstices more accurately than the instruments of the time allowed. A method for calculating planetary motion using ratios too elegant to be improvised. These fragments don't shout. They murmur. They suggest that someone, somewhere, had seen more, understood more, and passed it on, quietly. And those who received it kept it alive, even if they didn't know her name. Because the truth is, legacy isn't always grand. Sometimes it's a single sentence in a scholar's diary. I learned this from a woman, long ago, who read the stars better than any man. Sometimes it's a diagram on the back of a torn page, added in pencil, with no explanation. Sometimes it's just the presence of a method, so refined, so consistent, that it could only have come from someone who studied the sky not once, but over a lifetime. That was her real gift. Not a monument, but momentum, a quiet push forward in the great, slow movement of knowledge. She didn't leave a legacy built to impress. She left one built to survive. Not above ground, where fire could find it, but below, where it could rest until it was needed. You wouldn't last a day building something so fragile, so intentional. But she did. And now, Her legacy lives in the hands of those who never met her, who never saw her face, who don't even know they're following her path. A girl who studies the stars today, not because she was told to, but because she wants to. A boy who draws patterns on his bedroom wall, connecting dots no one else notices. A scientist who wonders where her ideas came from, why they feel borrowed, older, deeper. They're walking roads she helped map, without ever knowing it. And perhaps that's the most fitting tribute of all, because she never worked for glory. She worked for understanding. She didn't write to be quoted. She wrote so someone, someday, might understand the sky just a little more clearly. So if you're reading this, and wondering what's left of her, the answer is simple. Everything that matters. Not the books, not the name, but the impact, the quiet proof that knowledge, when protected, when shared, when passed hand to hand, can outlive any fire. You wouldn't last a day being forgotten like that. But she wasn't really forgotten. She was absorbed, folded into the minds of others, woven into the questions we still ask. Why does this star return every 19 years? Why does this planet shift when no one expects it? Who first saw this pattern, and why did they keep it secret? The answers don't come with her name, but they come from her. She is the invisible ink beneath the lines, the soft outline beneath the painting, the whisper beneath the lecture. And though history may have tried to forget her, the stars never did. Because even now, in every quiet moment spent looking up, in every question that begins with wonder, she lives. Not in glory, not in story, but in motion, still circling, still watching, still remembered, even when no one says her name. If you've made it this far, through the fragments and fires, through the silence and stars, then perhaps you already understand. This wasn't just a story about a woman. It was a story about what happens when truth is too quiet to defend itself, yet still refuses to disappear. She had no crown, no sword, no monument, and still, she changed things. Not with power, but with pattern. Not with noise, but with knowing. Not by standing in the light, but by reading it, one star at a time. You wouldn't last a day in her world. Most wouldn't. She lived with suspicion at her doorstep, with fire behind her, and the sky above her, too vast to hold alone. And yet, she did. She worked when it was unsafe. She wrote what no one wanted to read. She passed on what she could, quietly, in case the future needed it. And it did, because centuries later, we still ask the same questions she once did. Why do the stars move as they do? Why are some voices lifted and others lost? And what does it mean to know something the world isn't ready to hear? Her name is gone, but her method lives. Her voice is missing, but her vision survives. She was not famous, but she was first. First to map, first to warn, first to understand. Not for glory, but because she believed knowledge was worth protecting, even in hiding. So the next time you look at the night sky and feel small, remember, someone once looked at those same stars and found not fear, but logic, not prophecy, but pattern, not divinity, but design. And in doing so, they left a trail, not a path of light, but of thought, not a monument, but a mirror, because this story wasn't meant to end with her. It was meant to reach you, quietly, patiently, like starlight. You wouldn't last a day in her shoes. But maybe you weren't meant to. Maybe you were meant to walk in your own, carrying just enough of her story to know that silence can be powerful, that truth can travel without names, and that some fires cannot burn everything. She is gone, but she was never lost, because the sky remembers. And now, so do you. Today, we think of the teenage years as a kind of in-between space, a hallway between childhood and adulthood, a place for finding yourself, making mistakes, listening to sad music in your bedroom, and wondering if anyone will ever understand you. We call it coming of age, and we treat it like a rite of passage. But for most of human history, this hallway didn't exist. There was no in-between. You were a child, and then, one day, you weren't. It happened quietly, or suddenly. No fireworks, No college applications, just a shift in what you were expected to do. In the medieval world, especially in rural Europe, there was no word for teenager. There were no guidance counselors, no school dances, no phases. People didn't ask, "What's she going through?" They asked, "Can she carry a bucket of water yet?" And the answer to that question mattered a lot more than your feelings. Children worked. From the moment their hands could grip a tool, they were part of the household economy. They fetched firewood, herded animals, spun thread, helped in the kitchen, learned the family trade. There was no question of waiting until they were ready, because nobody had time to wait. Time was something you didn't waste. Not when winter could kill you. Not when your average life expectancy hovered around 35. In many places, turning 12 or 13 didn't mean rebellion. It meant readiness. For boys, it could mean swearing fealty to a lord, becoming a page, or working full-time in the fields. For girls, it could mean marriage, pregnancy, motherhood. At 12, there was no time to figure out who you were, because by then, you already had a role to fill. Not a dream, a duty. That doesn't mean people didn't have emotions, or longings, or fear. It just means they had to carry those feelings while also carrying water, or a child, or the weight of adult responsibility. And no one asked how they felt about it. The moment your body changed, your life changed with it. No explanation, no preparation. You might wake up one morning still sore from playing with sticks in the mud, and by nightfall be told you're now the man of the house, or that it's time to meet your future husband, or that your older brother died in the fields, and someone needs to take his place. There was no room for transition. There was only expectation. Even the idea of preparing for adulthood is a luxury of modern life. Back then, you didn't prepare. You performed, or you failed. And if you stumbled, the village didn't say, "He's going through a phase." They said, "He's lazy." Or worse, "He's no good." The pressure was quiet, but immense. There was no therapy, no safe spaces, only the judgment of those around you, and the responsibilities they expected you to meet. In stories passed down from the Middle Ages, very few focus on youth. Most tales begin when the character is already doing something adult, fighting, working, leading. There is no pause to describe a moody adolescence, no lingering on self-discovery, because growing up wasn't something you waited to do. It was something that happened to you, ready or not. This doesn't mean we're weaker today. It means we have more space to ask, to learn, to grow slowly. And that space was earned through centuries of survival. But if someone took away your phone, your options, your choices, and told you, "You must act like an adult today," you might not last. Not because you lack strength, but because you've been allowed something better. Time. Time to try, fail, and try again. Time to define who you are before being defined by duty. For most people in history, that time never existed. There was no teenage dream, no angst, no rebellion, only childhood. And then, work. In the medieval world, 12 wasn't the start of adolescence. It was the start of adulthood. By law, by custom, by expectation. At 12, you were no longer just a child. You were someone who could be married, someone who could be punished as an adult, someone who was expected to take on real responsibility, not eventually, but now. It didn't matter how tall you were, or whether your voice had changed, or if you still liked playing games in the dirt. 12 was enough. In medieval Europe, the age of 12 was often the legal threshold for many adult roles. In some parts of England and France, a 12-year-old boy could swear an oath of loyalty to a feudal lord. He could become a page, a servant, a squire, the beginning of a long, harsh climb toward knighthood. And with that oath, he accepted a new role, that of a man in training, a warrior in progress, a future that might come sooner than he expected. For girls, 12 could mean something even more final. Marriage. Church law across much of Europe allowed girls to marry at 12. Not just be betrothed, actually married. And once married, pregnancy wasn't far behind. To modern eyes, this seems unthinkable. But in the logic of the time, it made sense. The moment your body changed, your role changed. If your body could bear children, then society expected you to do so. No questions, no waiting, no personal development, just duty. Girls could be promised to husbands years older, sometimes even decades. The marriage wasn't just a romantic arrangement. In fact, it rarely was. It was a transaction, a bond between families, a way to strengthen alliances, trade, or status. You didn't get to choose. You didn't get to say, "I'm not ready." You were 12, and that was enough. In some cultures, 12 also meant you were criminally responsible. No more leniency for mistakes. If you stole a loaf of bread or broke a law, the court didn't treat you like a lost child. You were punished as an adult, sometimes whipped, fined, or worse. The idea of childhood as protection didn't stretch very far. Not legally, not socially, not emotionally, because in the world they lived in, survival didn't wait. In rural villages, especially, 12 might mean you were now old enough to farm alone, to manage animals, to take on a craft, or replace a dead parent in the family trade. Imagine being told, "Your father's gone. You're the man now. Not someday. Today." And that wasn't unusual. It was expected. Even in royal courts, where lives were more luxurious, 12 marked the beginning of a different kind of burden. Young princes were sent off to be trained in statecraft. Girls of noble birth were matched to foreign kings or noblemen. They had to smile, obey, and carry the weight of diplomacy on shoulders that had only just stopped growing. In many ways, the age 12 became a cliff. You stood at the edge as a child, and the next step was adulthood. No railing, no stairs, just a fall into responsibility. There were ceremonies sometimes, a public confirmation in church, a family blessing, a quiet, nodding acceptance. But most of the time, it was just assumed. No celebration, no party, only more work. There were no psychologists, no coming-of-age novels, no gentle transitions. You learned from watching others, from being scolded, from failing, and then doing it again, better. There was no space for doubt. And if you had fears or questions, you kept them to yourself. It wasn't just hard. It was normal, because everyone around you had gone through the same thing, and no one had asked them if they were ready either. So why 12? It wasn't magic. It was practical. By 12, most children could contribute real labor. Their bodies had begun to change. Their minds had adapted to the world's harsh rules. And most importantly, life was short. With death so close and survival so uncertain, there was no time to ease into adulthood. Every year counted. Every strong back mattered. So society pushed its children forward, quickly, without looking back. 12 was not the age to start dreaming. It was the age to start carrying water, carrying expectations, carrying a future that was no longer optional. You were still small, still scared, still wondering about the world. But the world didn't wait. 12 was old enough, and old enough was all that mattered. One day, you're in the yard, chasing chickens. You're laughing, throwing sticks, splashing your feet in the mud. You're a child. You don't know much about the world. Just that the sun rises, the bread is warm, and the ground smells like home. And then one morning, everything changes. You wake up, and the games are over. Someone hands you a task, not a pretend one, a real one. You're told to watch the fire, or walk the goat, or carry a basket of turnips to the neighbors, and don't drop a single one, because now it matters. That's how quickly it happened. There was no ceremony, no warning, just responsibility. Not everyone got the same task, of course. It depended on who you were, where you were born, and what your family needed. But the shift came all the same, sometimes quiet, sometimes with the death of an older sibling, sometimes because the harvest failed, or someone fell sick. You were playing yesterday. Today, you're standing in line at the village well, holding 2 buckets that are almost your size, trying not to spill, trying not to cry. You're not quite ready, but no one asks if you are. In medieval life, Work was not something you eased into. It was something you inherited, absorbed, accepted. You mimicked your parents, your older siblings. You watched, you tried, you failed, and then you did it again, but better. There were no chores the way we think of them now, minor duties in exchange for allowance or screen time. Work was survival, and survival didn't care about how old you felt. You might be 8 years old and chasing birds one day, then 9 and told to stay up all night keeping wolves away from the sheep. No one explained how. You just figured it out, or you didn't. Girls often faced the shift earlier than boys. They were pulled into the rhythm of the household, learning to grind grain, tend fires, feed siblings, spin wool, wash linens, mend everything. By 10, some could manage an entire kitchen. By 11, they knew how to deliver a baby. By 12, they could be one. For boys, the work looked different, but the pressure was the same. Plough fields, split wood, tend oxen, hunt, fence, fight. Not play fight. Real fight, sometimes with animals, sometimes with other boys, sometimes with men. It wasn't glamorous. It was muddy, painful, cold, exhausting. Your back ached, your hands blistered, your skin cracked in winter. And still, the work didn't stop. No one said thank you. They expected it, because that's what growing up meant. And the truth is, you didn't grow up slowly. You grew up by demand, because someone needed you to, and because there was no one else. Maybe your father was gone, your mother sick, the village short on hands, a war was coming, or taxes had to be paid. There were moments of joy, of course, laughter over bread, a warm fire, the sound of your sister singing as she worked. But the joy was woven tightly with duty, not separate from it. And if you resisted, you paid a price. Not just in punishment, but in reputation. A child who didn't adapt quickly was a burden, a mouth without enough hands, a risk. Because in a world that didn't forgive weakness, there was no place for someone who couldn't carry their share. So you changed. Not all at once, but fast. You stopped playing. You watched your tone. You stood straighter. You spoke less. You stopped complaining. You learned to listen, to wake up before the sun, to work until your legs shook. You forgot what it felt like to lie in the grass without thinking. You forgot what it meant to not be needed. And when you looked back, maybe at 13 or 14, you couldn't remember the last time you felt like a child. Because that version of you had disappeared. Not with a farewell, but with a chore. Growing up didn't come with a birthday cake. It came with a bucket, or a shovel, or a crying baby. The world asked, "Can you do it?" And whether you were ready or not, you said yes. Because that's what was expected. And because, back then, saying no was never an option. There was no class, no handbook, no circle of chairs and a gentle adult saying, "Let's talk about what's happening to your body." No one explained hormones. No one mentioned mood swings. No one said, "It's normal to feel overwhelmed." Because in the medieval world, growing up wasn't a topic. It was just something that happened. And when it happened, you were expected to know what to do. You were expected to act older, to be responsible, to carry weight, physical, emotional, spiritual, without anyone telling you how. No one asked, "How are you feeling today?" They asked, "Did you finish your task?" That was the language of care. That was what mattered. If your voice cracked, or your chest hurt, or your stomach flipped with feelings you didn't understand, you were told, "You'll get used to it." Or worse, "Stop acting strange." You didn't cry in public. And if you did, someone told you to be quiet. Because children didn't have inner worlds. Not officially. They had roles. They had chores. They had duties. The rest, the thoughts, the fears, the changes, those were yours to keep. Quietly. There were no words for identity crisis. No one said, growing pains. There was no adolescent psychology. No guidance counselor waiting behind a tidy desk. There was the priest, maybe, or your mother, if she had time. or your older brother, if he wasn't working, or the neighbor's boy, who might tease you or shrug and say, "It's just life." You learned by watching, by imitating, by getting scolded, by messing up and doing better next time, or being punished until you did. There were rules, but they were rarely explained. They were lived, unspoken, passed down through glances and expectations. You knew, somehow, that if you spoke too loudly at the table, people stared. If you walked too slowly to the fields, someone snapped. If you didn't show up for your turn at the well, people remembered. There were no lectures, just consequences. There was no privacy, no time alone to figure yourself out. You shared your bed, your meals, your tools, your days. Your body changed in the middle of all that, under scrutiny, under pressure, under dirt. And when you reacted, when your temper flared, or your chest tightened, or you said something foolish, you weren't seen as struggling. You were seen as misbehaving, as rude, or difficult, or disrespectful. There was no grace for growing, so you learned to hide it, to swallow the questions, to quiet the storms inside your chest, to straighten your back and pretend you understood. You didn't, but you had to, because everyone else was pretending, too, and no one had time for your confusion. Even if your voice broke in the middle of a sentence, you kept speaking. Even if your skin flared with heat and shame, you kept working. Even if you couldn't sleep at night from thoughts you couldn't name, you kept showing up in the morning. Growing up was not something you talked about. It was something you endured, and endured silently. You didn't know what self-discovery meant. You knew what your father expected. You knew how many buckets to fill. You knew how many lashes you might get for disobedience. And over time, your confusion didn't go away, but it got quieter, buried under repetition, under the sound of the loom, the rhythm of the hoe, the weight of your younger sibling asleep on your back. Eventually, you stopped asking. You learned that being grown meant not needing help, not showing doubt, not being soft, even if you still were. In the world you lived in, there was no room for transition, no pause between who you were and who you had to be. There was only the gap between expectation and consequence, and you crossed it alone. You were never really taught how to grow up. You just started pretending you already had, until maybe, one day, you realized you weren't pretending anymore, and that was it. No milestone, no applause, just another morning, another task, another version of you, grown and quiet and tired, and still learning how to carry the day. Your hands are still small, your shoulders narrow, your legs can't quite reach the stirrups. Your voice breaks when you speak too loudly, but none of that matters, because in the eyes of the world around you, you're old enough to carry, old enough to give, old enough to be useful, and that is what matters most. In the medieval world, your body didn't define your role. Your usefulness did. If you could hold a broom, you could clean. If you could walk a mile, you could carry. If you could understand orders, you could follow them. No one waited for your back to straighten. No one asked if your arms hurt or your knees trembled. If the work needed doing, and it always did, you were expected to do your part. You might be 4 feet tall, weighing little more than a sack of flour, but someone still handed you a pail of water and pointed to the well, or a bundle of sticks and pointed to the fire, or a crying baby and said, "Take care of it." There were no allowances for size, no modifications, no special instructions for the young ones, because youth was not a protected class. It was a passing condition, one that ended as soon as it inconvenienced the household. And sometimes, even sooner. Children were not cherished as ideas, or futures, or dreams. They were present labor. The more hands, the better. And if the hands were small, they were still hands. You worked beside your parents, beside your siblings, not as a spectator, but as part of the engine that kept the family alive. And it wasn't just chores. It was pressure. It was responsibility, real, often heavy, sometimes dangerous. You could be sent to market alone, to the fields alone, into the woods to gather kindling, or to the neighboring farm to help with threshing. You weren't just helping, You were expected to succeed, and if you failed, the consequences were real. If you spilled the grain, it was waste. If you lost the money, it was shame. If you left the door unlatched and the fire went out, or the animals wandered, it wasn't a mistake. It was a failure. And people didn't forget. Discipline was often swift. A harsh word, a cuff to the ear, or worse, because you were expected to know better, even if your body hadn't caught up yet, even if your bones still ached from growing, even if you couldn't quite lift what they asked you to. Still, you tried, because trying was not optional, and over time, the trying became doing. Your muscles learned what your heart hadn't, to keep moving, to keep carrying, to keep giving. Sometimes, you shared the load, but often you bore it alone, and that loneliness wasn't seen as cruelty. It was seen as growing up. For girls, the burden could be even heavier. Their bodies changed fast, but they were still small, still fragile, still learning. But once their bodies could carry life, they were expected to do so. Pregnancy at 13 wasn't shocking. Marriage at 12 wasn't scandal. It was just part of the world's rhythm. Another task to be taken on, another weight to be borne, even if their arms were barely strong enough to carry firewood, even if their feet had never wandered beyond the village, even if their voices still trembled when spoken to. They became wives, mothers, caretakers, while still children themselves, and no one told them they were too young, because no one believed they were. The body didn't matter, not really, only the work did. If your back bent under the weight, you straightened it. If your breath came short, you learned to breathe deeper. If the tools were too large, you learned to grip them tighter. And eventually, the body adapted. It grew, not by time, but by use, by repetition, by force, by the demands of the day. You might still dream in the way children dream, of warmth, of rest, of someone noticing when you're tired. But in the world around you, dreams didn't matter. Only action, only endurance, only whether you could carry what was given to you, even if it was too heavy, especially if it was too heavy, because that's what being grown meant. Even if your hands were still small, in the world before clocks and calendars ruled every corner of life, age was a loose idea. No one asked you, "How old are you?" They asked, "What can you do?" Age didn't determine your place. Ability did. If you could work, you worked. If you could carry, you carried. If you could serve, or help, or mend, or lead, then you did. It didn't matter if you were 10 or 14 or just barely taller than the doorframe. If your hands could hold a tool and your mind could follow instructions, you were old enough. Old enough to contribute. Old enough to be counted. In the fields, no one kept score of birthdays. They looked to see who ploughed straight, who finished first, who came back with full baskets. In the home, it wasn't your age that mattered. It was whether you could churn butter without spilling, tend the fire without letting it die, calm a crying child, or carry water without stopping. Your value wasn't in years. It was in action. And so, childhood blurred, faded, became a memory, sometimes too early to even remember. One season, you were the helper. The next, you were in charge. And no one marked the shift. It just happened, as all things did, silently, without ceremony. There were no rites of passage, not really. No celebrations to declare, "You are an adult now." Just more work, more weight, more watching eyes waiting to see if you could carry your share. If you could, you were respected. If you couldn't, you were shamed. Not with cruelty, perhaps, but with silence, with disappointment, with lowered expectations, which in that world could feel heavier than any burden. In some villages, you might hear whispers of someone's age. She's 15 and already runs the kitchen. He's not yet 12, but works like a man. But those were observations, not exceptions, because ability was the standard. And so, children shaped themselves around what they could do, not what they felt. They learned that competence brought praise, that being useful earned a place. and that anything less was seen as weakness, indulgence, or immaturity. In towns, apprenticeships worked the same way. No one cared when you were born. They cared if you could be trusted with the tools, with the customer, with the money. You became a blacksmith's apprentice not at 16, but when your hands were steady. You were trusted with the baker's oven not at 18, but when you could wake before dawn and never burn the bread. You might lead a hunting party not as a grown man, but as a 15-year-old who had already tracked deer alone for 3 winters. It was never about age. It was always about proof. What you could show. What you had done. What others had seen. And for girls, it was no different. You were judged not by your softness or smile, but by what you managed. How well you wove. How fast you stitched. How calmly you handled a sick child or a drunk husband or a harsh winter. You weren't a woman when you turned a certain number. You were a woman when the village looked at you and saw someone they could depend on. Even the sick and elderly were not exempt from this measurement. A grandmother who could still spin wool or tell healing stories was honoured. An old man who could no longer chop wood but knew the stars, he mattered too. Because it was always about what you could give, what you could pass on, what you could still do. In this way, time became physical. Not something you carried in your mind, but something that lived in your body, in your calluses, your gait, the lines on your palms, not your birth year. And that made aging both softer and harder. You weren't protected by youth, but neither were you dismissed by age, as long as you could still contribute. A child with strong hands and quick thinking was treated like an adult. An elder who could no longer walk might still be the village's memory. Your identity, your worth, your place, it was not a number. It was what you could do. And in that, there was both freedom and pressure. No fixed timeline, but no excuses either. You grew not in years, but in utility. And the day you were no longer seen as a child was the day someone asked you to do something hard, and you did it. Not perfectly, but well enough. Without help, without protest. That was the moment you were seen as grown. Even if your feet still dangled above the floor, even if your voice still cracked when you spoke, you were enough. Because you could do. We talk about adolescence as if it's a natural part of life. As if it's always been there, waiting patiently between childhood and adulthood. A bridge made of mood swings, messy rooms, and long sighs. But it's not. Not really. Not historically. For most of human existence, the idea of a teenager simply didn't exist. There were children. There were adults. And not much in between. The space we now call adolescence, a time to discover yourself, explore identities, rebel a little, make mistakes safely, that space is a luxury. A recent one. A modern invention. In the past, people didn't wait for a child to become emotionally or psychologically ready. They waited for them to become useful, or for their body to signal readiness, through puberty, through strength, through capacity. And when that happened, the transition was fast. Sudden, often irreversible. One day, you were a child chasing chickens in the yard. The next, you were wearing shoes that didn't fit and carrying expectations that never would. There was no protected time in between. No gap for becoming. No extended journey inward. You became someone through what you did, not what you discovered. The modern teenager, awkward, questioning, creative, sometimes lost, would not have fit in. Or if they had, it would have been brief. They'd be given work, a role, or a marriage, and the questions would go quiet. Not answered. Just buried. So where did this in-between space come from? It didn't emerge from biology. It emerged from economics, from culture, from progress. In the 19th and especially 20th century, things began to change. Industrialization created new kinds of labor, new family structures, and, most importantly, the idea of school as a holding place. More and more children weren't needed on farms or in family trades. They were sent to classrooms instead, to learn, to wait, to stay. And when they weren't immediately needed for survival, something rare happened. They had time. Time to ask, who am I? Time to worry about how they looked. Time to think about music, friendships, futures, and fears that didn't involve weather or war or winter hunger. As countries became wealthier, childhood stretched longer. Children didn't need to become adults at 12 anymore. So they didn't. Instead, a new category was born. A liminal space. Not quite child, not quite grown, capable in some ways, fragile in others. It was adolescence. And it was strange. For parents used to urgency and utility, this new phase looked indulgent. They didn't understand the sadness that came with no clear purpose, or the frustration of becoming, without knowing what you were becoming into, or the weight of choice, hanging where once there had only been duty. Adolescence gave time, but not direction, freedom, but not always structure. And so, it became a space of exploration, and often, confusion. It was no longer enough to be good at something. You had to choose what that something meant, who you wanted to be, what kind of life you would lead. And that kind of freedom was terrifying. For the first time in history, entire generations were expected to find themselves. Not in the fields, not in battle, but in classrooms, diaries, bedrooms, and songs. It was messy, and beautiful, and deeply human. It's easy to forget how recent this is. The word teenager didn't even appear in common use until the 1940s. Before that, you were a child, then a young man, or a maiden, or a worker, or a wife. Identity was not something you invented. It was something given to you by family, religion, gender, class. But the modern world asked for more. It offered more choice, more years to decide, more chances to fail. And with that came the emergence of youth culture. Music, fashion, slang, subcultures. The idea that you could be different from your parents, and that was okay, even expected. The teenager became a symbol, not of instability, but of possibility. A person still in progress, still shifting, still writing the outline of a life. But this invention, this adolescence, came with new burdens. Before, you were measured by obedience and labor. Now, you were measured by self-awareness, by dreams, by potential. You were told to explore, to experiment, to become, but sometimes without a clear map, without a guide, without a finish line. And so, modern adolescence became as full of pressure as it was of promise. You didn't just need to grow, you needed to grow right, to express yourself, to succeed, to become someone original. That's a heavy ask. In the past, your path was narrow, but clear. In the present, your path is open, but overwhelming. We talk often about how hard life used to be, and it was. But don't forget, in some ways, modern life is harder, because freedom can feel like weight, too. So yes, adolescence is new. It's recent, invented by comfort, by progress, by the luxury of time. But that doesn't make it fake. It makes it fragile, a space we must protect, not because it's always easy, but because it was so hard won. A quiet room to grow, to wonder, to not be sure yet. And maybe that's all it needs to be. If growing up was hard, growing up as a girl was harder. Not just earlier, not just faster, but heavier, in ways the world rarely acknowledged. A boy might become a man when he could lift a tool, swing a blade, walk a long distance alone. But for a girl, it could happen with a single moment. A change in her body, a bloodstain on her dress, a quiet glance from an older man. There was no pause, no question, no preparation. The moment she was seen as ready, she was no longer seen as a child. In many medieval societies, that age was around 12, sometimes younger. The law said it plainly, a girl could be married at 12. And if she could be married, she could be a wife. And if she could be a wife, she could be a mother. And if she could be a mother, then her childhood was over, whether she wanted it or not. There were no long conversations about emotional readiness, no comfort in the idea of taking your time, because no one gave her time. Not her family, not her husband, not the world. She was expected to step into her role fully, quickly, and without complaint. And it wasn't just about marriage. Even before that, girls were being prepared for duty, domestic, emotional, spiritual. From the moment they could walk, they followed their mothers, watched how to tend fires, feed infants, sow, grind grain, sweep ash. By age 7 or 8, many could manage a household task alone. By 10, they were often raising younger siblings. By 11, they were expected to behave with modesty, with grace, with obedience. Every movement was watched, every word measured, because a girl didn't just represent herself. She represented her family, her purity, her patience, her silence. These were considered virtues, marketable ones, sometimes dowry-worthy. A son might fail, rebel, run wild for a few years. A daughter could not. A single mistake, a flirtation, a pregnancy, a word too loud, could mark her forever, could cost her family honor, marriage, future. So she learned early to carry herself softly, to hide her thoughts, to obey quickly, to smile when spoken to say thank you, even when nothing was given. And underneath all that, the weight, because she wasn't just carrying chores, she was carrying expectations, that she would marry well, bear children safely, endure pain quietly, be both strong and invisible. And if she did all of that, perhaps she would be called a good woman, not praised for joy or brilliance, but for surviving. Pregnancy came early. So did grief. Infant mortality was high. Many girls became mothers before they stopped being scared of the dark. They bled. They cried quietly. They labored. And they kept going, because there was no other option. Even in noble families, where girls wore jewels instead of aprons, the weight didn't disappear. It simply changed shape. A noble daughter was a bargaining chip, a diplomatic bond. She might be sent far away, to marry a man twice her age, in a language she didn't speak, to bear heirs for a throne that wasn't hers. She was trained to curtsy, to speak sweetly, to know her place. Even in palaces, silence was expected. Grace under pressure wasn't a virtue. It was a survival skill. And if she failed, if she couldn't bear children, if she questioned her role, if she spoke out of turn, she was a burden, a disappointment, sometimes a punishment waiting to happen. Yet in all of this, women kept the world turning. They fed villages, kept families whole, passed on stories, healed wounds, led quietly, and sometimes loudly, when no one else would. Some ruled, like queens and regents. Others resisted. Many endured. And still, most were forgotten. Their names weren't carved in stone. Their stories weren't written in ink. But their fingerprints are everywhere, in every hearth, every cradle, every field that grew wheat from hands too small for the plough. So yes, girls grew up fastest. Not because they wanted to, but because they were made to. They stepped into adult roles with small frames and wide eyes, carrying not just tasks, but silence. Not just work, but expectation. Not just children, but entire lineages on their backs. They grew up in kitchens, in labor beds, in the space between fear and endurance, and they kept going, because no one else would, and because the world never gave them permission to stop. In the modern world, we assume time. We assume that people will grow up, that a child will become a teenager, then an adult, then something more, that they will have time to make mistakes, time to dream, time to begin again. But for most of human history, time wasn't promised. It was borrowed, and often it was brief. The truth is simple and hard. Not everyone lived long enough to grow up. In medieval Europe, the average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years. That doesn't mean people dropped dead at 35, but it means many never made it that far. Infants died often, sometimes before they were named. Children, even more. A fever, a cut, a cough in winter, and even if you made it to 10, 12, 15, that didn't guarantee anything. A bad harvest could starve you. A war could conscript you. A childbirth could kill you. An accident with a horse, a fire, or a poorly prepared herb could end your story before it even began. So people lived fast. Or rather, they didn't wait. They didn't wait to assign responsibility, didn't wait to marry, didn't wait to work, because waiting was dangerous. Waiting meant leaving things unfinished. And there was no time for unfinished lives. You could be a parent at 13, a widow at 15, dead at 20. There was no guarantee you'd make it to reflection, to self-awareness, to anything resembling modern adulthood. Many died with childhood still clinging to their face, with dirt on their knees, with questions in their mouth. They didn't get to grow up. They just lived. And then they didn't. And for those who did live longer, into their 20s, 30s, beyond, it wasn't necessarily easier. They carried more grief, more losses, more ghosts. They remembered siblings who didn't survive, friends who disappeared, children who never made it past their first winter. Mourning was not rare. It was routine. And yet, life moved on. Because it had to. Because the living needed to eat. Because the cows still needed milking. Because survival didn't pause for sorrow. Still, in quiet corners, people must have wondered, what might he have become? What would she have said if she'd lived long enough to speak in full sentences? Who would I be now if I'd had more time? But those thoughts stayed quiet. Because grief, like everything else, had to be endured. Privately, efficiently. And so, the idea of growing up became not a right, but a rare reward. Something for the lucky. Something for the strong. Something for the chosen. In this way, age became distorted. A child of 10 who had lost a sibling, worked the fields, and carried wood was seen as more grown than a man of 30 who had done little. Experience mattered more than candles on a cake. Suffering more than milestones. There were no sweet 16s. No college years. No slow unfolding into adulthood. There was now, and maybe tomorrow. No one expected you to find yourself. They just hoped you'd stay alive long enough to be found. And if you didn't, the world moved on. The earth was turned. A grave was dug. Another child was born. Another day began. The rhythm of life was relentless. But it wasn't cruel by design. It was simply indifferent, unapologetically fast. And so, the modern idea of a long, safe, guided childhood, of adolescence, of identity, of mental health and emotional space, that idea feels miraculous in comparison. Because in the past, life wasn't shaped by growth. It was shaped by survival. You didn't grow into adulthood. You were thrown at it. And if you caught it, if you lasted long enough, you were lucky. Not everyone did. So when we think of growing up, we think of it as a journey, a slow unfolding, a becoming. But for most of human history, growing up wasn't a path. It was a cliff. And not everyone made the jump. Some slipped before they could leap. Some never had the chance to try. Some were called grown before they understood the word. And many simply vanished. From sickness, from war, from silence. Their names forgotten. Their stories never told. Not because they weren't important, but because they weren't given time. We like to think growing up is the same everywhere. That it's a universal story of learning, of change, of slow transformation. But history tells a different story, a faster one, a harsher one. In the past, childhood ended not with celebration, but with responsibility. Not with a party, but with a task. You didn't ease into adulthood. You were expected to become useful, and quickly. And if you weren't, you were left behind. There was no adolescence, no pause between stages. You were a child, then you were not. And if your body changed, then your life changed too. You might not understand what was happening, but that didn't matter. You had a job to do, a role to play, a family to help, a future to carry, even if your hands were still small. For boys, it meant work. For girls, it meant marriage. For both, it meant growing up in silence. Fast, without guidance, without grace. And for many, too many, it meant not growing up at all. because life was short and brutal and unforgiving. Children died. Teenagers disappeared into labor, war, childbirth. Adulthood came quickly, if it came at all. There was no room to ask, who am I? What do I want? What will I become? Those questions belonged to a future no one could count on. But now, things have changed. Now we talk about adolescence. We talk about identity, about self-expression, emotional safety, and personal growth. We speak of finding yourself, like it's a rite of passage. And it is, but only because we've created the space for it. That space is new. It is precious. It is not universal, and it was not guaranteed. We forget how recent this idea is, that young people should have time to think, to breathe, to wonder, to change their minds, to make mistakes, and still be allowed to continue forward. That is a gift, not a weakness. A gift built on centuries of suffering, of rushing, of not having the time to even ask the question, who am I becoming? So what do we do with this knowledge? We don't mourn the past, but we learn from it. We let it remind us that time is not just something we measure, it's something we protect. When we give someone space to grow slowly, to be unsure, to struggle, we're giving them something many people before them never had. Not because they didn't deserve it, but because the world didn't allow it. Now it does. At least, more than before. And that means we have a responsibility too, not just to grow, but to remember, to be patient, to be kind, with others, and with ourselves. Because growing up, even now, is still hard, still confusing, still full of invisible weights. But at least now, we can talk about it. We can name it. We can give it time. And that, in the long echo of human history, is something extraordinary.